techniques, and now more specifically that of budding, which you should have some familiarity with now. The techniques of budding. And so we're still using a scion here. However, the scion piece is reduced down to one single bud rather than a stick that's 6, 7, 8 inches in length. So just a modification of the grafting technique. Still requires a rootstock and a scion. And we're still joining two plant parts together. Still requires that nurseryman to go through the process of selecting a rootstock, either a seedling rootstock or a clonal rootstock. And then, just as important, selecting the appropriate scion wood and doing so at the appropriate time of year. Tea budding and chip budding tend to be the two most common types and most popular types of budding techniques used in the modern nursery. Single budders that are working with somebody else that's doing the tying, think of one person that's doing the budding technique and the second person is doing the tying, and they just go down the nursery row. In one day, they can do 2, 3, maybe 4,000 trees if they're skilled technicians. And likewise, if they have a good technique going down and they've got good rootstock and scion wood, they can expect those seasoned technicians to have a success rate of 90% up to 100%. We can also do budding as a top working event, an established tree in an orchard or in a home landscape. Likewise can be tea budded or chip budded. So moving on here, let's describe also the advantages of budding compared to just grafting in general. You think about the fact we said that rather than having a single bud stick that's 6 to 8 inches in length with numerous buds on it, here we're just reducing our scion piece down to a single bud. This reduces the number of trees that are needed to supply wood for scion wood. That means fewer workers needing to maintain those trees. So it makes wise use of space and labor. Maybe another advantage of budding is maybe I've got limited scion wood. Perhaps there's only one unique tree that I want to make more of. And if I start removing sticks from the canopy of that tree and do a typical grafting technique like a whip and tongue graft or a whip graft, I'm far more limited on the number of grafted plants I have if I use just a normal grafting technique. Whereas if I bud that one unique tree, I have many, many more opportunities. It makes wiser use of that budwood. So that's an advantage also. The budding techniques, they're also very simple. It does take some effort and skill to develop the proper technique, but they are simple techniques. There are nurseries in England that will combine budding with normal grafting techniques, and it becomes like a backup system. So typically what they'll do is in the summertime or maybe early spring is perform their budding technique, go through the season of production, and then those trees where the bud didn't take, where the bud wasn't successful, they will come back and do a normal graft on it. So sometimes in production they use both budding and grafting, and we see some of that going on in nurseries in England. The conditions for budding. We have to pay attention to the environmental conditions for budding, because in tea budding we'll see we say the bark needs to be slipping. That period of time during the year where growth resumes and there's active cell division in the cambial tissue, and during this period of time it's easy to separate the bark away from the wood. This is a requirement for some of our budding techniques, especially tea budding. Not so with chip budding, as we'll see, but that's, again, for some of our budding techniques, that's an important condition, that the bark is slipping away from the wood. I think, also as a grafter, a nurseryman, you need to pay attention to the growing conditions and be certain that the rootstocks are growing in a healthy condition. They're well watered. They're not in any type of stress that may limit their productivity or their health. So moving on now from the advantages and the conditions. And again, remember, this is just like regular grafting, whereby the nurseryman needs to make a choice between clonal rootstocks or seedling rootstocks. The timing of budding can vary, and this depends on geographic location, maybe to some degree the species being propagated. We can consider 3 production schedules in the northern hemisphere as a timing for budding, and it would be what's known as spring budding, June budding, and finally summer budding. And this just describes a production schedule of sorts, how you would organize materials and labor and efforts over time. So let's go through each of these: spring budding, June budding, and summer budding. And we'll go into this next graphic here and describe first the spring budding. So regardless of the production schedule, we've made plans for our rootstock. We're either going to plant seeds or cuttings. The seeds would germinate, the cuttings would take root. So if we start with that spring budding schedule, we've planted that seed or those cuttings and they start to grow that spring season vigorously through the spring season, and that may continue into the summer season. And that goes on into the fall season. So we complete 1 year of growth here, just rootstock alone. Most often, these rootstocks are growing out in the field, in mineral soil, rather than in containers. So it goes through 1 season of growth. From the fall, we move into the winter, that period of dormancy. The leaves will drop off. The plant's in a very low state of growth. And then as we go back into that spring season, this might be early March to sometime in April, depending on our location on the North American continent. But it's that period of time where growth resumes and that plant's coming now out of dormancy and rebudding. This is the period of time where we will perform the bud very early in the season. So here we are in Texas, the Gulf Coast. This could be as early as early to mid-March. What we should note here is we should have collected our scion wood during the dormant season. So that previous winter, we've gone out to our selected trees, collected our scion wood from the previous year's growth. And we've just held it in cold storage. We've packed it in wet newspaper, maybe wet sphagnum moss. So in the spring budding, during that winter season, we've gone out, collected our budwood. Okay, so on that specific day when we're ready to do our tea budding or our tea budding, whatever it may be, we pull it out of storage and we begin budding those rootstocks. We watch it, evaluate it as it heals. And those buds that heal, we will cut away that top portion of that rootstock just above the graft union. Okay, so those of you that did the tea budding of the peach here on campus a few weeks ago, this is exactly what you were doing. You had 1-year-old rootstocks. It's early in the spring. The bark was slipping and they were tea budded. And again, you slowly evaluate over 2 or 3 week period of time those buds that take. We cut off the top portion of the plant, which of course is that rootstock. So that healing continues through the spring and into the summer. It's forcing growth into that bud. This bud now is trained to be the top portion of that graft combination. And that continues on into the fall season, enters into a period of dormancy. And now as we enter the winter season, we've completed 2 production years. So we go through now into that second winter, and we have a plant that has a 2-year-old rootstock and a 1-year-old top. At this point, those trees would either be dug up and transplanted into containers and sold, or maybe just transplanted into their final home out in the orchard. Okay, so spring budding, as the name implies, we do the budding in the spring. More importantly, at the end of the cycle, we have a tree that has a 2-year-old rootstock and a 1-year-old scion, or top portion. Okay, so this works well in Texas and along the Gulf Coast. We see this used extensively in the nurseries in Southern California, where there's a very big fruit industry. Tends to be a popular budding production cycle in areas that have milder winters and that the spring season arrives earlier. Or maybe it's a region of the globe where you have intense heat in the summertime, and because of that intense heat, there's a lack of callus formation and lack of success in graft union formation. So it almost, because of the heat of the summer, it forces you to do this in the spring season. Now, let me drop down to the bottom part of this graphic, and we're going to look at summer budding. Likewise here, you've made plans for some type of rootstock, either seed or cuttings, and they're placed out into the field. They germinate those seeds, or the cuttings begin to root. They continue to grow spring into summer. It's allowed to continue to grow. Now, we're still in that first year. We get up towards later in summer. This might be August, or maybe even the first 2 weeks of September. And we perform the bud. So again, we're at the bottom here, summer budding. We have that 1 year of growth on the rootstock, and now we get up to about fall and we do the budding technique, but we don't cut off the top part of the plant. It remains. And it goes into the fall season. Okay, and I'm evaluating it, I'm caring for it, it heals. But now we're going into the fall season and into the winter in a state of dormancy, very little growth. Going now into that second year as growth resumes in the spring, I'm going to cut back that rootstock to just above that graft union formation. Remember, I grafted it the previous August or early September. It was a success. And now here I am the next spring, and I'm cutting it back. So as growth resumes in that spring, it's forcing all those stored carbohydrates in the root system up into that new bud. And of course, that new bud is trained into the new top portion of the plant as that continues through the summer and partially into that second fall. So that by that second winter, I'm digging up a tree that has essentially a 2-year-old rootstock and only a 1-year-old top. Because the majority of that growth on the top portion of the plant occurred in that second year, even though you did the graft in the first year. So summer budding tends to be more popular like in Oregon, the upper Midwest, where they have longer winters, milder summers. England would be another location where they do summer budding. So as you can see here, this technique, and let me say, by the way, with roses, just about all of our roses are budded also. particularly tea budding, and they may stay out in the field another year as they're trained before they're dug up and put into containers. Okay, we still see some rose production in Texas, particularly around the Tyler area. Lots of rose production in California. Now that's, if you think about fruit trees here, that's a long production cycle before you're able to get that grafted tree out into the orchard or into a container. There is another production cycle that's used by some nurseries, and it's become popular in portions of California, and that's June budding. So again, here in June budding, that the budding technique is going to take place in late May to early June. But we're going to try to reduce this down to a single year. So again, I'm the nurseryman. I've made plans for my space that's needed, what type of rootstock I'm going to use. And so I plant my seed or my cuttings, and they begin to root and grow and develop this first season. So I'm going through April into May. And now as I get into late May or into June, this is when I perform my budding technique. So I'm doing my tea budding, and I'm caring for it, evaluating it over the next few weeks. Now the key here is you don't want to cut back the top portion of that grafted plant immediately. We need some of that top growth to continue to capture sunlight, photosynthesis, and supply that plant with sugars from photosynthesis. So it's sequentially cut back over the summer months. That is the top portion of the rootstock. We sequentially cut it back all the way to that point, just right above the graft union. And this happens over a period of a few weeks, so that by later in the summer and into the fall, that plant's forcing growth into that scion piece, that single bud. Therefore, when we get to that first winter, the tree is dug. The tree's dug up from the field, and we have a 1-year-old rootstock and a 1-year-old top portion of the plant. June budding, we really can't get away with this here in Texas because we start getting temperatures at 95 or higher in June, sometimes in May. And that's true along the Gulf Coast here. So this tends to be used in like Spain, parts of France, parts of California, where it has become more popular, where we can condense down the production cycle to a single year. So, if you think about climatically across the United States, it doesn't work in much of Texas and the South because our summers are too hot. But this wouldn't work further north, like in the upper Midwest or Oregon, because there's not long enough of a growing season. So there's some other areas where they can still successfully get away with this June budding cycle. So this describes our steps in production and the timing of budding for the nursery system. Let's go off now and look at some specific budding techniques. I told you that tea budding and chip budding are the two most common types of bud, not the only types of budding, but the two most popular types in the nursery industry. There was a study that came out in mid to late 1980s showing, it was a study in England, and a very good study that showed that chip budding might yield stronger graft unions in the grafted tree compared to tea budding. And so as nurseries caught on to that information, they slowly started switching their production to chip budding in that nation. And I'd say many of the growers in the northeastern United States and the Midwest, our northern growers of the United States have also switched over to chip budding for that reason. There's this possibility that I can have a stronger bud union, graft union, using chip budding versus T-budding. So chip budding, you know that with the rootstock, it can be actively growing or it can be dormant. And so I can perform this technique in the winter season. I can potentially do it in the summertime or the spring. The Scion piece now, I'm removing a single bud from my Scion wood. And as I cut down and remove that single bud, I'm going to include in it some of the wood from that stick. And I join the two pieces together. They have to fit together rather snug, like pieces of a puzzle fitting together just right. And this has been a technique that seems to work well for thin-barked tree species. So cherry, plum, apricot, those would be some examples of some thin-barked tree species where some nurserymen have found comfort in chip budding as a technique. So yeah, we try to have our rootstock and we're going to remove a notch from it. That includes a portion of the wood, and now we need to carefully remove a piece of the bud from that stick. There needs to be some care by the budder to cut out a bud that is the same dimension as that notch that's been cut out in the stock piece. Okay, so you'll see the dimension of that bud, the depth of it, the width of it, nearly identical to the notch that's been created in the stock piece so that it fits in there snugly. And just as importantly, the cambial tissue of the two pieces line up. And that is tantamount to the success here in successful graft union formation. You know, it's helpful if you have a stock and a Scion piece that are about the same diameter. Okay, so enough of that animation, and just some examples here of some shade trees that have been chip budded. You're removing a single bud, makes wise use of that bud wood, and that single bud that's removed also has some of that underlying wood, and it fits snugly into place on that rootstock, tied off to make good intimate contact, held firmly in place. Keeps out the critters, reduces desiccation. And then over a period of time, we watch that bud as growth resumes and it's green. That's a good indicator that it's a successful union. So that is our chip budding technique. So remember what we said, the rootstock in chip budding can be slipping, or it can be dormant. So that leaves us with a pretty wide opportunity there for our timing. Now with T-budding, remember our window of opportunity is more narrow because the bark has to be slipping. And that's how we base the timing of this technique. This is still a common method for grafting fruit trees. As I talk to nurserymen here in Texas, it's still a very popular method with all of our stone fruits, that'd be peach and plum, apricot. And it's used still across the nation in nurseries. So the T-budding technique, it's a horizontal cut and a vertical cut. There's been some debate on which one you perform first, the horizontal cut or the vertical cut. I think it's just a matter of personal preference. You want to not make the cuts any longer than you need to. You need to make them quickly because remember, as you make that T-shaped cut and you lay those flaps open, you're exposing those live cells, that cambial tissue, and it's subject to drying out. And we don't want that to happen. We want to protect those live cells. And that allows them to receive that bud and make good contact with it, and then the healing process begins. Now, the budwood, we've collected that the previous winter season. We've gone out to our selected trees, cut out the sticks. We've placed them into cold storage, packed in wet sphagnum moss or newspapers, wet sawdust. We've kept the mold in check. And then we pull them out that day that we're going to start budding. And we just ever so carefully beneath the buds start to remove a single bud. And with some speed, now we want to insert it into that slot that we've created on the stock piece, on the rootstock. Which do you perform first? Do you cut the rootstock first, or do you prepare the budwood first? Again, I think it depends on the individual grafter's technique. I recall many years ago working at a nursery where I spent a week tea budding with two workers that had spent most of their life budding fruit trees and avocado trees. And what they would do when I worked with them, and they were very successful and good at what they did, they would first prepare the bud. They'd cut the bud off and they'd stick it on their tongue and hold it there. And I'm not telling you to do this. This is an observation. They would remove the bud, hold it on their tongue, and then make the T-shaped cut on their rootstock, reach up, remove the bud from their tongue, and slide it into place. And again, I'm not telling you have to do that, but they were had a success rate that was near 100%, and they could perform in a single day, 2,000 or 3,000 grafts. So lots of variation, as we've just talked about. You just want to find a technique that is successful. And again, like throwing a football, riding a bicycle, the more you do it, the better you get at it. You develop some craftsmanship. Okay, so we're not finished there. We need to protect this graft union, and that's where we use a strip of horticultural tape or a grafting rubber band to hold those two pieces together firmly as the healing begins. And so we monitor it, and some of you have had the chance to do this, over 2 or 3 weeks. If it's successful, you'll see that bud is still green and begins to emerge. And you can then remove that adhering material, the grafting rubber band or the horticultural tape. So that is our tea budding technique. Again, it works well with thin bark species. So we mentioned fruit trees. It's used on some Japanese maples also that are grafted and used, of course, for shade trees and a few other shade tree species. So our tea bud. Which do you do first? Prepare the stock or the scion piece? It's personal preference. In the animation here, they're removing the bud first, making the T-shaped cut, inserting the bud. We'll watch the animation here one more time. T-shaped cut. Lay the flaps open, insert the bud. And actually, this is not finished. There needs to be that horticultural tape or the grafting rubber band going around it. All right, so that's our tea budding technique. So moving on now to another budding technique known as patch budding. Texas has historically a very large pecan industry, and we've historically had a lot of pecan nurseries. And there's other states in the union that have a pecan industry. And what growers found, looking back 50, 60, 70 years ago was it's very difficult to do patch budding with some of these thick bark species, and pecan would be one of those. And to some degree walnut. And so they modified their technique and came up with something known as patch budding, whereby I'm going to remove a patch, a rectangular patch of wood from my rootstock and replace it with a patch from my Scion piece. So this is used much more so in our nut crops. So a patch is removed from the budwood, this rectangular piece. More common with thick bark species. What's key here for this technique is it has to be this period in spring where the rootstock is slipping so that I can easily remove that patch from the rootstock. And I'm going to go out and collect budwood, usually from that previous season's growth, but it's already started to resume growth, and therefore the bud separates easily from the wood of my Scion piece. So now as I think about the pecan industry in Texas, this happens most often in April. There's this 2 or 3 week window in April where it's just ideal for patch budding with our climate, with that crop. Okay, so we have a special double-bladed patch budding knife, and we come up to our rootstock. And again, this may be a 1-year-old or 2-year-old rootstock. It might be an established tree in the orchard. Whatever it may be, the rootstock is in this condition of resuming growth. The bark is slipping. And I select my location on the rootstock with my double-bladed knife, and I make my horizontal cuts. And then with my regular grafting knife, I make my vertical cuts, and I remove this patch. And I can reach up there with my fingers and just pull that bark right off of the limb. Then I use my double-bladed patch budding knife, likewise on my budwood. Remove a single bud. And again, I collected this, and it's at a period of time when the bark is slipping so that I can easily remove that single bud. I just use my thumb and forefinger to pull it off there and place it onto that patch. I might have to trim it a little bit, to make it fit into that rectangle just snug. So it's in there now, and I need to make sure it stays in place. And this is where I use, of course, my horticultural tape or a grafting rubber band to wrap it up and make sure the bud is exposed. And similarly, just like we've talked about in chip budding and tea budding, over the next 2 or 3 weeks, there should be evidence of a resumption in growth of that bud. It's elongating, it's swelling, and that's an indicator that I have a successful graft union formation. So this is patch budding, and it has become popular in the pecan nursery as a technique of growing grafted pecans. Again, there are other budding techniques. They are they're minor compared to what we've described here. There's an inverted T-bud, there's an I-bud. Commercially, we don't see their techniques used much. And we've also tried to align this with some of the specific crops. And, we mentioned fruit tree crops and roses and our nut trees also. All right. So again, I take my double-bladed knife to make my horizontal cuts, a single-bladed knife to make the vertical cuts. I pull it off the Scion stick. And I might have to trim it a little bit as I place it into that patch on the rootstock. And again, remember, you're exposing some cambial tissue there, so you want to do this quickly so that that cambial tissue doesn't dry out. and we get it in place, and again we wrap it up and evaluate it, care for the tree. So that brings us up to the end of our grafting techniques.